The sound of gunfire echoed through the dusty streets of Fallujah as Staff Sergeant Maria Rodriguez pressed herself against the crumbling concrete wall, her breath coming in short, controlled bursts. What her fellow Marines didn't know was that each breath was fighting against something far more pressing than enemy fire. At 8.5 months pregnant, Rodriguez had concealed her condition through baggy uniforms and sheer determination, but now, in the middle of the most intense firefight of her deployment, nature was demanding its due. The contractions had started 2 hours ago, mild at first, easily mistaken for the adrenaline and stress of combat. But as the Taliban fighters pressed their attack on the forward operating base, Rodriguez felt her body betraying her in ways she'd never imagined possible. Commander Jack Sullivan of SEAL Team 6 had seen his share of impossible situations, but nothing in his 20-year career had prepared him for what he was about to witness. The grizzled veteran from Montana had earned his reputation through countless missions in Afghanistan, Iraq, and classified operations that would never make it into official reports. His weathered face bore the scars of improvised explosive devices, his hands steady despite the shrapnel fragments still embedded in his left shoulder from a mission in Helmand Province 3 years prior. Sullivan commanded respect, not through volume or intimidation, but through an almost supernatural ability to remain calm when chaos erupted around him. His team knew that when Sullivan spoke, lives hung in the balance, and his words carried the weight of experience earned through blood and brotherhood. Rodriguez had earned her place among the Marines through years of proving that her 5'4" frame could carry just as much weight, fire just as accurately, and lead just as effectively as any of her male counterparts. Growing up in East Los Angeles, she'd learned to fight before she could properly tie her shoes. The daughter of a construction worker father and a nurse mother who both worked double shifts to keep their family afloat. The military had offered her a path out of the cycle of poverty and violence that claimed too many of her childhood friends, but more than that, it had given her purpose. Her fellow Marines knew her as someone who never backed down from a challenge, who volunteered for the most dangerous patrols, and who could make split-second decisions that saved lives. What they didn't know was that for the past 6 months, she'd been carrying a secret that could end her career and shatter the trust she'd spent years building. The pregnancy had been unplanned, the result of a brief relationship with a fellow Marine during a 2-week leave in Germany. When she discovered her condition, Rodriguez faced an impossible choice. She could report it and be immediately removed from active duty, sent back to the States to ride out her pregnancy behind a desk, or she could find a way to complete her deployment and serve alongside the men and women who depended on her. She chose the latter, binding her growing belly, modifying her uniform, and enduring morning sickness in silence while maintaining the same grueling pace as her unit. Physical training became a careful balance of staying combat-ready while protecting the life growing inside her, a secret she shared with no one. The Taliban attack had come at dawn, a coordinated assault on the forward operating base that caught the Americans during their most vulnerable moment. Rodriguez and her squad had been conducting a routine patrol of the perimeter when the first rocket-propelled grenades screamed overhead, their distinctive whistle followed by explosions that shook the ground beneath their boots. Within minutes, the base was surrounded, and what should have been a standard patrol became a desperate fight for survival. Rodriguez found herself separated from her squad, taking cover behind a concrete barrier as automatic weapons fire chipped away at her protection with methodical precision. That's when the first real contraction hit, a wave of pain so intense it nearly drove her to her knees. Rodriguez bit down on her lower lip until she tasted blood, forcing herself to maintain her grip on her M4 carbine while her body screamed in protest. The baby was coming, and there wasn't a damn thing she could do about it. Through her radio headset, she could hear the chaotic chatter of her fellow Marines calling out positions, requesting ammunition, and coordinating their defense. She wanted to call for help, but how could she explain that she needed medical evacuation not because of enemy fire, but because she was about to give birth in the middle of a combat zone? Commander Sullivan had been monitoring the radio traffic from his position 300 yards away, where his SEAL team had been providing overwatch for the Marine patrol. When the attack began, Sullivan's team immediately moved to support the Marines, but the intensity of the enemy fire had pinned them down behind a low wall near the base's communications center. Sullivan could see through his scope that several Marines were trapped in exposed positions, including one who seemed to be in distress near the eastern perimeter. Something about the Marine's posture and movement patterns triggered Sullivan's instincts, honed by years of reading body language and recognizing when someone was fighting more than just the enemy. Rodriguez tried to time her breathing with the gaps in gunfire, but the contractions were coming faster now, each one more intense than the last. She could feel her water break, a warm sensation that mixed with the cold sweat of fear and exertion. Through gritted teeth, she keyed her radio and tried to make her voice sound normal as she reported her position and status to her squad leader. But Staff Sergeant Williams knew his people, and he immediately detected something wrong in Rodriguez's voice, a strain that went beyond combat stress. The situation deteriorated rapidly as more Taliban fighters emerged from concealed positions throughout the surrounding buildings. The Americans found themselves outnumbered and outgunned, their ammunition running low as the enemy pressed their advantage. Rodriguez realized that her squad was moving to extract her from her exposed position, but she also knew that any rescue attempt would put her fellow Marines directly in harm's way. As another contraction gripped her, she made a decision that would have seemed impossible just hours earlier. She was going to have to fight her way out while simultaneously bringing a new life into the world. Commander Sullivan watched through his scope as the Marine near the eastern perimeter began moving in ways that defied tactical logic. Instead of maintaining a defensive position, the Marine was advancing toward enemy positions while seeming to struggle with some invisible burden. Sullivan's training told him this was either the actions of someone who had been wounded and was disoriented, or someone operating under conditions that no one else could understand. He made a split-second decision that would change everything. Sullivan keyed his radio to the command frequency and issued orders that surprised even his own team members. He directed 2 of his SEALs to provide covering fire for the advancing Marine, while he personally moved to intercept and assess the situation. As Sullivan low-crawled across 50 yards of open ground under enemy fire, he began to piece together what he was seeing. The Marines' movements weren't random or panicked, they were calculated, but constrained by something that wasn't immediately visible. Rodriguez saw the SEAL commander approaching her position and felt a moment of panic that had nothing to do with the Taliban fighters. Sullivan's reputation preceded him, and she knew that his tactical expertise would immediately recognize that something was fundamentally wrong with her situation. As he slid into cover beside her, Rodriguez tried to maintain her composure, but another contraction hit just as Sullivan was asking for her status report. This time there was no hiding what was happening. Sullivan's eyes widened as he realized what he was witnessing, but his voice remained steady as he keyed his radio. Instead of calling for medical evacuation or questioning Rodriguez about how she had managed to conceal her pregnancy, Sullivan did something that would become legendary among both Marine and SEAL communities. He looked Rodriguez in the eyes and asked a single question that would determine the next course of action for everyone involved in the firefight. The question Sullivan asked wasn't about Rodriguez's condition or how long she could continue fighting. Instead, he asked about the tactical situation from her perspective, treating her as the experienced warrior she had proven herself to be, rather than as a pregnant woman who needed to be rescued. Rodriguez's response, delivered between contractions and bursts of return fire, demonstrated why she had earned the respect of her peers and why Sullivan immediately recognized her as someone who could handle an impossible situation. Sullivan made a decision that violated every protocol in the military handbook but followed the deeper law of combat leadership. The mission comes first, but you never leave anyone behind. He radioed his team and the Marine squad with a series of orders that created a defensive perimeter around Rodriguez's position, while simultaneously maintaining pressure on the attacking Taliban forces. What happened next would be studied in military academies and recounted in barracks around the world as an example of leadership under impossible circumstances. The contractions were coming every few minutes now, and Rodriguez knew she had maybe an hour before the baby arrived, whether she was ready or not. Sullivan coordinated the defense with the precision of a conductor leading an orchestra, directing covering fire ammunition resupply, and casualty evacuation while never leaving Rodriguez's side. He had faced enemy fire in a dozen countries, survived explosions that should have killed him, and led men through situations that existed only in nightmares. But nothing had prepared him for coaching a fellow warrior through childbirth while simultaneously fighting for their lives. As the battle raged around them, Sullivan found himself drawing on skills he never thought would be relevant to combat operations. His mother had been a nurse, and he had grown up hearing stories about emergency deliveries and medical crises. His wife had given birth to their 2 daughters during his deployments, experiences he had only heard about through satellite phone calls from bases thousands of miles away. Now surrounded by enemy fire and with limited medical supplies, Sullivan was about to become an unlikely midwife in the most dangerous delivery room imaginable. Rodriguez pushed through each contraction while maintaining her fields of fire, her training taking over, even as her body demanded her complete attention. She had spent years proving that she could perform at the same level as her male counterparts, and she wasn't about to let pregnancy become the thing that finally broke her. Between contractions, she continued to provide accurate suppressing fire, call out enemy positions, and coordinate with her squad members who were fighting desperately to reach her position. The Taliban fighters began to realize that something unusual was happening near the eastern perimeter, as the intensity of defensive fire seemed to be coordinated around a specific position rather than distributed across the entire base. They concentrated their attack on Sullivan and Rodriguez's position, bringing rocket-propelled grenades and heavy machine gun fire to bear on the concrete barrier that provided their only protection. Sullivan called for close air support, but the nearest aircraft was still 20 minutes out, and he knew they didn't have 20 minutes. That's when Rodriguez made a decision that would define the rest of the engagement. Between contractions that were now coming every 3 minutes, she proposed a tactical solution that leveraged their desperate situation into a strategic advantage. Sullivan listened to her plan and realized that sometimes the most impossible circumstances created opportunities that would never exist under normal conditions. He keyed his radio and issued the single order that would turn the tide of the battle and ensure that both Rodriguez and her unborn child would survive the day. The order Sullivan gave was simple, direct and completely unprecedented in military history. He told his team and the Marine squad to execute a tactical maneuver that would use Rodriguez's position as the anchor point for a coordinated counterattack. Instead of trying to extract her from the danger zone, Sullivan's plan would bring the fight directly to the Taliban forces, while providing Rodriguez with the medical support she needed to safely deliver her baby in the middle of combat. Rodriguez felt the baby crowning just as Sullivan's counterattack began, the sound of American automatic weapons and explosive ordnance creating a symphony of violence that would serve as the unlikely soundtrack to new life entering the world. Sullivan positioned himself to provide medical assistance, while his team executed the most complex tactical operation of their careers, fighting on multiple fronts while protecting a birth that was happening under fire. The baby's first cry mixed with the sound of gunfire as Rodriguez delivered her daughter in the shadow of a concrete wall, with a SEAL commander serving as midwife and a squad of Marines providing security. Sullivan cut the umbilical cord with his tactical knife, the same blade he had used in dozens of classified operations, now serving the most important mission of his career. As he wrapped the newborn in his own field jacket, Sullivan realized that this moment would define his legacy more than any medal or commendation he had ever received. The Taliban attack faltered as American reinforcements arrived, drawn by the intensity of the fighting and Sullivan's tactical coordination. The enemy fighters found themselves caught between the defensive perimeter around Rodriguez and the advancing relief forces, their coordinated assault dissolving into a desperate retreat. As the sound of battle faded, replaced by the approaching helicopters that would evacuate Rodriguez and her newborn daughter to safety, Sullivan looked down at the tiny face peering out from his jacket and understood that some orders transcend military doctrine. Rodriguez named her daughter Hope, a decision she made while lying on a stretcher as the medical helicopter lifted off from the forward operating base. Commander Sullivan, covered in dust and still carrying the tactical gear that had saved their lives, watched from the ground as the aircraft disappeared into the morning sky. In his official report, Sullivan would describe the engagement as a successful defense of the base, with no friendly casualties, but he would never mention the miracle that had occurred under fire. Years later, when Hope Rodriguez Sullivan started school, she would carry the last name of both her mother and the man who had delivered her in the middle of combat. Commander Sullivan had quietly arranged the legal paperwork during his next leave, explaining to his wife that some families are created through blood, while others are forged through shared impossible moments. Rodriguez would go on to complete her military service and eventually become a training instructor, teaching young Marines about leadership under pressure and the importance of never underestimating the person fighting beside you. The story of Hope's birth would become part of military folklore, passed down through generations of service members as an example of how the most extraordinary circumstances can reveal the true character of ordinary people. Rodriguez and Sullivan would remain close friends for the rest of their lives, their bond forged through a shared experience that defied every regulation and protocol, but embodied the deepest principles of military service. They had faced an impossible situation and emerged with something more valuable than victory. They had created life in the middle of death and proven that sometimes the most important orders are the ones that come from the heart rather than the handbook. Sullivan retired from active duty 5 years later, but he never forgot the lesson he learned that day in Fallujah. Leadership isn't about following procedures or maintaining discipline under normal circumstances. True leadership emerges when everything goes wrong, when the situation exceeds all training and preparation, and when the only choice is between impossible and unthinkable. In those moments, the best leaders don't consult their manuals or call for higher authority. They look at the people depending on them, assess what needs to be done, and issue the orders that save lives regardless of what the regulations say. Rodriguez continued her military career for another decade, eventually reaching the rank of major and commanding her own Marine unit. She never hid Hope's unusual birth story, instead using it as a teaching tool for young Marines who thought they understood the meaning of adapting and overcoming. When new recruits complained about difficult training conditions or impossible standards, Rodriguez would tell them about the day she gave birth while returning enemy fire, and how a SEAL commander she had never met became family, through a single decision to treat her as a warrior rather than a victim of circumstances. Hope grew up knowing that her first moments in the world had been accompanied by gunfire and protected by heroes, but also understanding that her mother had never used her pregnancy as an excuse to avoid danger or shirk responsibility. The little girl would often ask to hear the story of her birth, and Rodriguez would tell it honestly, explaining how fear and pain had been overcome through training, determination, and the support of people who refused to abandon their responsibilities to each other. The forward operating base where Hope was born was eventually abandoned as American forces withdrew from the region, but the concrete wall where Rodriguez had taken shelter became an unofficial monument to the men and women who had served there. Graffiti left by later units included messages honoring the Marine who had given birth under fire and the SEAL commander who had delivered a baby while fighting for their lives. The story had spread throughout the military community, growing with each telling but maintaining its essential truth that ordinary people can accomplish extraordinary things when they refuse to accept that something is impossible. Commander Sullivan's single order had been simple: protect the Marine and support the mission, treating both objectives as equally important and non-negotiable. In the years that followed, military leadership courses would study the tactical decisions made during that engagement, but the professors would focus on Sullivan's ability to adapt his planning to circumstances that existed outside all previous experience. The lesson wasn't about the specific tactics he employed, but about his willingness to make decisions based on the situation in front of him, rather than the situation described in training manuals. When Hope turned 18, she enlisted in the Marine Corps, following in her mother's footsteps, but carrying the additional weight of a birth story that had become part of military legend. At boot camp, her drill instructors initially tried to use her famous origins as a source of pressure, assuming that the daughter of heroes would crumble under the weight of expectations. Instead, they discovered that Hope had inherited both her mother's determination and Sullivan's calm adaptability, approaching every challenge with the quiet confidence of someone who had been born into impossible circumstances and raised to believe that there was always a way forward. Rodriguez attended Hope's graduation from basic training, wearing her dress blue uniform and the decorations she had earned through 20 years of service. Commander Sullivan, now retired and working as a consultant for military contractors, sat in the same row, watching the young woman he had helped bring into the world take her oath as a Marine. The ceremony was routine, one of hundreds that took place every year as new recruits became Marines. But for Rodriguez and Sullivan, it represented the completion of a circle that had begun in combat and continued through years of friendship and shared responsibility. The single order that Sullivan had given that day in Fallujah had been more than a tactical command. It had been a declaration that some things transcend military hierarchy and protocol. When he saw Rodriguez in distress, he could have called for medical evacuation and followed standard procedures for handling a pregnant service member in a combat zone. Instead, he recognized that Rodriguez was still a Marine, still capable of fighting, and still deserving of the same respect and support that would be given to any other warrior in the same situation. The battle itself had lasted less than 4 hours, but its impact would influence military policy and training for decades to come. The engagement demonstrated that modern warfare required leaders who could adapt to circumstances that existed outside traditional planning parameters, and that the most effective military units were those that valued individual initiative and creative problem-solving over rigid adherence to established procedures. Rodriguez and Sullivan had proven that sometimes the best way to follow orders is to ignore them completely and focus on the mission that matters most. Hope's birth had occurred at the exact moment when Sullivan's counterattack reached its crescendo. American and Taliban forces engaged in close-quarters combat while new life entered the world, just yards away from the fighting. The timing seemed impossible, as if the universe had conspired to create the most unlikely birth story in military history. But Rodriguez and Sullivan both understood that timing in combat is rarely a matter of luck. The baby had arrived when she did, because Rodriguez had fought through hours of labor while maintaining her duties as a Marine, and because Sullivan had created the conditions that allowed both mother and child to survive an impossible situation. In her retirement speech, Rodriguez would reflect on the lessons she had learned from that day in Fallujah, emphasizing that the military's greatest strength wasn't its equipment or tactics, but its ability to create bonds between people that transcended normal human relationships. She had trusted Sullivan with her life and the life of her unborn child because she recognized in him the same commitment to mission and fellow service members that had driven her to continue fighting while in active labor. That trust had been rewarded with a level of support and protection that went beyond duty or regulation, reaching into the realm of family and shared sacrifice. Commander Sullivan's final active duty assignment included writing a training manual on leadership in unconventional circumstances, drawing heavily on his experiences from that day in Fallujah. The manual became required reading for officers throughout the military, not because it provided specific tactical guidance, but because it illustrated the principles that should guide decision-making when all normal procedures had failed. Sullivan's central thesis was that the best military leaders were those who could recognize when the situation required them to invent new solutions rather than apply existing ones. The concrete wall where hope had been born was eventually destroyed by later conflicts in the region, but its significance lived on in the stories told by the men and women who had served at that forward operating base. New arrivals would be shown the location where Rodriguez had given birth under fire, and they would hear the story of how a SEAL commander had issued orders that violated every protocol, but embodied every principle that made the military effective. The story served as a reminder that their mission wasn't just about following orders or completing objectives, but about taking care of each other regardless of circumstances. 25 years after Hope's dramatic birth, Rodriguez and Sullivan would be invited to speak at a joint service leadership conference where they would address an audience of officers from all branches of the military. Their presentation would focus not on the tactical details of that day in Fallujah, but on the human elements that had made their success possible. They would emphasize that the most important orders are often the ones that aren't written down anywhere. The commands that come from understanding what really matters when everything else falls apart. The audience would listen in respectful silence as Rodriguez described the experience of giving birth while returning enemy fire, and as Sullivan explained his decision-making process during those critical hours. But the most powerful moment would come when Hope, now a Marine officer herself, joined her mother and Sullivan on stage to represent the living proof that impossible circumstances sometimes create the most extraordinary outcomes. The three of them standing together would embody the military's core values of honor, courage, and commitment, demonstrating that these principles could guide people through situations that existed far beyond the boundaries of normal human experience. In the end, the story of Hope's birth would be remembered not just as an unusual combat engagement, but as an example of how the right people in the right place at the right time could overcome obstacles that seemed insurmountable. Rodriguez had proven that pregnancy didn't disqualify her from serving her country effectively, and Sullivan had demonstrated that true leadership means making decisions based on what's right, rather than what's safe or conventional. Together, they had shown that the military's greatest victories often occurred not on traditional battlefields, but in moments when service members chose to support each other beyond all reasonable expectations. Commander Sullivan's single order had changed everything. Not because it was particularly clever or innovative, but because it recognized Rodriguez as the warrior she had always been and provided her with the support she needed to complete an impossible mission. The order itself would never appear in any official record, but its impact would influence military culture for generations, serving as a reminder that the most important commands are often the ones that acknowledge the humanity and capability of the people who serve.